The mead hall reeked of sweat, spilled ale, and the musky scent of bodies pressed too close together in celebration. Astrid felt the jarl's calloused fingers trace along her bare shoulder as she served him another horn of honeyed wine, his touch lingering longer than necessary while his new bride sat mere feet away, laughing with the other noble wives. The weight of his gaze burned through her simple linen dress, and she could feel every eye in the hall watching this dangerous game they had been playing for months. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she leaned forward to refill his cup, close enough to smell the leather and iron that always clung to him, close enough to see the dark hunger flickering in his storm-gray eyes. The wedding feast had been raging since dawn, and Astrid's legs trembled with exhaustion as she wove between the long wooden tables, serving the endless stream of guests who had come to witness Jarl Bjorn's political alliance with the daughter of a neighboring clan. The bride, Sigrid, was barely 18, with pale braids and frightened doe eyes, married off to secure grain shipments through the coming winter. But it was Astrid whom the Jarl's gaze followed as she moved through the smoky hall. Astrid, whose presence made his jaw clench with barely restrained desire. Astrid, who had been warming his bed in secret for the past season while negotiations for this marriage dragged on. She had been born a thrall, daughter of Irish slaves captured in a raid when she was barely old enough to walk. 23 winters had passed since then, and she had grown beautiful in the way that made free men forget their station and slaves forget their place. Her hair fell in copper waves past her shoulders, and her green eyes held defiance that no amount of bondage had been able to crush. The Jarl had noticed her last summer when she had dared to meet his gaze directly instead of looking down like the other servants, and something had sparked between them that burned hotter than forge fire. The great hall groaned under the weight of celebration, its timber walls hung with the best tapestries the Jarl owned, depicting scenes of past victories and fallen enemies. Torches flickered in iron sconces, casting dancing shadows across the faces of warriors drunk on victory and ale. The Jarl's high table dominated the far end of the hall, where he sat in his carved oak chair like a king surveying his domain, his broad shoulders draped in a rich blue cloak fastened with silver brooches. His dark beard was threaded with early gray, and scars crossed his knuckles and forearms like white lightning, each one earned in battle or single combat. Astrid had not eaten since before dawn, too nervous about this day to keep anything down. The wedding meant everything would change between them, though neither had spoken of it directly. She was property, and he was about to become a husband to another woman, bound by oaths and the need for political alliance. Yet, when she approached his table now, exhaustion making her movements less graceful than usual, she saw something fierce and possessive flicker across his features that made her stomach tighten with both fear and longing. The bride sat to his right, picking delicately at roasted venison while trying to smile at the crude jokes being shouted from the lower tables. She wore a dress of finest wool-dyed rich red, with gold thread embroidered around the sleeves and neckline, and her hair was arranged in the complex braids of a married woman. But she looked small and lost in the massive chair, dwarfed by the magnitude of her new position. And Astrid felt an unexpected pang of sympathy for this girl who had been traded like cattle to secure her father's alliance. The smell of roasted meat and fresh bread should have been appetizing, but Astrid's empty stomach churned as she watched the Jarl's new wife attempt conversation with the rough warriors surrounding her. These men had killed and raided across 3 kingdoms, their hands stained with blood and their hearts hardened by years of violence. Yet they were trying to mind their manners for their lord's political bride. The contrast between the delicate girl and the brutal company she now found herself in was stark enough to make even Astrid, who had grown up among these same men, feel the cruelty of the arrangement. As the evening wore on and the drinking grew heavier, the entertainment began in earnest. Skalds recited poetry about ancient heroes and great battles. their voices rising and falling with practiced rhythm while the hall listened in respectful silence. Musicians played pipes and lyres, filling the spaces between stories with haunting melodies that spoke of distant homelands and lost loves. But through it all, Astrid felt the jarl's attention like a weight upon her shoulders, drawing her gaze back to him again and again despite her efforts to focus on her duties. The political implications of this marriage were not lost on anyone present. The bride's father controlled the richest farmlands in the region, and with winter approaching and their own harvest having been poor, the alliance was necessary for survival. But politics and necessity had never stopped the jarl from taking what he wanted before, and Astrid knew that the hunger in his eyes had not diminished simply because he now wore a marriage ring. If anything, the forbidden nature of their attraction seemed to have sharpened it, making every glance between them feel charged with dangerous possibility. She stumbled slightly as she carried a heavy pitcher of ale toward the lower tables, her exhaustion finally beginning to show despite her efforts to maintain perfect composure. Several of the warriors laughed and called out crude suggestions about how she might better spend her energy, but their words felt distant and unimportant compared to the weight of the jarl's gaze tracking her every movement. When she glanced toward the high table, she saw him half risen from his chair, as if prepared to defend her honor, his hand resting on the pommel of his sword in a gesture that spoke volumes about the true nature of his feelings. The realization that he would fight for her, even here, even tonight, on his wedding day, sent a shock of heat through her tired body that was both thrilling and terrifying. She was a slave, without rights or protection beyond what he chose to grant her. Yet something in his bearing suggested that his claim on her ran deeper than mere ownership. The other thralls served their masters without inspiring such protective instincts. But then again, none of them had shared the intimate moments she had experienced in the jarl's private chambers, when he spoke to her as an equal and touched her with reverence instead of mere lust. As the night deepened and the celebration grew more raucous, Astrid found herself swaying on her feet as she attempted to clear empty platters from the tables. Her vision blurred at the edges, and the constant noise of conversation and laughter seemed to come from very far away. She had not slept properly in days, too anxious about what this wedding would mean for her future to find rest. And now the combination of exhaustion, hunger, and emotional turmoil was taking its toll. When she reached for a fallen cup near the jarl's elbow, her legs finally gave way, and she collapsed against his broad shoulder with a soft gasp of defeat, her copper hair spilling across his chest like liquid fire. The moment Astrid's weight settled against him, Bjorn felt something fundamental shift in the great hall, as if the very air had changed its character. Her exhaustion was complete, her breathing shallow and rapid against his neck, and the protective instinct that roared to life in his chest was so fierce it nearly drove him to his feet. Instead, he moved with deliberate calm, unfastening his finest cloak, the one embroidered with silver thread and trimmed with fox fur, and draped it over her slumped form with the careful tenderness of a man handling something infinitely precious. The hall had gone suddenly quiet, 200 pairs of eyes watching as he made his declaration, not with words, but with this single, unmistakable gesture of ownership and protection. His voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of absolute authority that had commanded warriors across battlefields and made kings reconsider their strategies. He announced to the assembled crowd that Astrid belonged to him, not merely as property, but as his chosen woman, and that any man who looked upon her with disrespect would answer to his blade. The words hung in the smoky air like a challenge, and several of the visiting jarls shifted uncomfortably in their seats, recognizing the dangerous territory he had just entered. His new bride sat frozen beside him, her face pale with shock and humiliation, while the political alliance he had just secured with his marriage trembled on the edge of dissolution. The implications of his public claim rippled through the hall like stones thrown into still water. Astrid stirred slightly in her exhausted slumber, unconsciously pressing closer to his warmth. And Bjorn found himself stroking her copper hair with fingers that trembled slightly from the enormity of what he had just done. He was a practical man, one who understood the necessity of political marriages and the careful balance of power that kept his lands safe. Yet, something about this woman had made him abandon caution in favor of truth. The fact that she had collapsed from exhaustion while serving at his wedding feast spoke to her dedication. But it also reminded him of how he had failed to protect her from the grinding demands of her station. Sigrid, his new wife, finally found her voice and whispered urgently that he was making a fool of himself and endangering the alliance her father had worked months to arrange. But Bjorn's attention remained fixed on the sleeping woman in his arms, noting the dark circles under her eyes and the way her work-roughened hands had relaxed in sleep. He had been taking her to his bed for months while simultaneously negotiating this political marriage, telling himself that desire and duty could exist separately. But seeing her collapse from the strain of serving his wedding celebration had shattered that comfortable lie. The visiting dignitaries began murmuring among themselves, and Bjorn could hear fragments of conversation questioning his judgment and speculating about the wisdom of allying themselves with a man who would publicly claim a thrall over his lawful wife. His own warriors watched him with expressions ranging from concern to admiration, knowing their lord well enough to recognize when he had committed himself to a course of action that could not be undone. The carefully orchestrated political theater of the evening was crumbling around them, replaced by something rawer and more dangerous. Astrid's breathing had deepened into true sleep, and Bjorn felt the trust implicit in her unconscious relaxation like a physical weight. She had worked herself to exhaustion in service to his household, had endured the agony of watching him marry another woman, and still her body instinctively sought comfort in his presence. The knowledge that she felt safe enough with him to sleep so completely, even in the midst of political chaos, strengthened his resolve to protect her, regardless of the consequences. His hand settled possessively on her hip, a gesture that several sharp-eyed nobles noted with raised eyebrows and meaningful glances. The bride's father, a shrewd man named Eric who controlled grain supplies across 3 valleys, leaned forward with barely contained fury and demanded to know if Bjorn intended to honor the marriage agreement, or if this display was his way of rejecting the alliance entirely. The question hung in the air like drawn steel, pregnant with the possibility of bloodshed and broken treaties. Bjorn met the older man's gaze steadily and replied that he honored all his commitments, but that his household arrangements were his own concern, a diplomatic response that satisfied no one while technically avoiding direct insult. The Great Hall's atmosphere grew increasingly tense as the political ramifications of Bjorn's actions became clear to everyone present. Several of the visiting jarls began calculating whether this disruption might provide opportunities to renegotiate their own agreements with him, while others wondered if his judgment could still be trusted in matters of war and alliance. The skalds had stopped their recitations, sensing that they were witnessing something that would become a story told around fires for generations. Though whether it would be remembered as romance or recklessness remained to be seen. Astrid shifted in her sleep, and the movement caused his cloak to slip, revealing the simple beauty of her features in the flickering torchlight. Bjorn adjusted the fur-rimmed wool carefully, ensuring she remained covered and warm. His movements watched by every person in the hall with the intensity usually reserved for the reading of omens. His warriors knew their lord's protective nature, but this went beyond anything they had witnessed before, suggesting depths of feeling that could reshape the political landscape of their region. Young Sigrid's composure finally cracked, and tears began streaming down her pale cheeks as she realized that her new husband's heart belonged entirely to another woman. Her wedding day, which should have been the culmination of months of preparation and negotiation, had been transformed into a public humiliation that would follow her for the rest of her life. The other noble wives at the high table tried to offer quiet comfort, but their own positions suddenly felt less secure as they wondered about their own husbands, loyalties, and the thralls who served in their households. The practical consequences of Bjorn's declaration began to crystallize in the minds of those present. If he truly intended to treat Astrid as more than property, questions arose about inheritance, about the legitimacy of any children she might bear him, and about the precedent this might set for other relationships between nobles and their servants. The careful social order that governed their world was built on clear distinctions between free and slave, between political marriages and personal desires. And Bjorn's public claim on Astrid challenged those foundations in ways that made everyone uncomfortable. As the night deepened and the celebration took on the surreal quality of a dream-turning nightmare, Bjorn found himself past the point of caring about political consequences. Astrid slept peacefully against his shoulder, trusting and vulnerable, while around them the carefully constructed alliance his marriage was meant to secure began showing cracks that might soon become breaks. He had spent his adult life making calculated decisions based on necessity and advantage. But something about this woman had awakened a fierce possessiveness that would not be reasoned with or compromised away, even if it cost him everything he had built. Dawn crept through the horn windows of the great hall like an unwelcome guest, revealing the aftermath of celebration and the harder truths that daylight always brought. Astrid woke slowly, consciousness returning in fragments as she became aware of unfamiliar warmth surrounding her and the rich scent of fox fur against her cheek. The jarl's cloak enveloped her like an embrace, but it was his arm around her waist that truly anchored her to wakefulness, strong and protective even in sleep. The hall had mostly emptied during the night, leaving only a few sleeping warriors sprawled across the tables and the cold ashes of burned-down torches to mark what had been a night of profound consequence. Bjorn stirred as she moved, his gray eyes opening immediately with the alertness of a man accustomed to danger, and for a moment they stared at each other in silence while the magnitude of what had transpired settled between them. His public declaration had changed everything, transforming her from hidden mistress to acknowledged woman. But the cost of that transformation was written in the grim set of his jaw and the tired lines around his eyes. Astrid realized with a sick feeling that she had slept through the political crisis her collapse had triggered, leaving him to navigate the treacherous waters alone while she lay unconscious against his shoulder. His new wife was nowhere to be seen, and when Astrid asked quietly about Sigrid's whereabouts, Bjorn's expression darkened further as he explained that the girl had fled to her chambers in tears shortly after midnight. Her father and his retinue had departed before dawn without the customary farewell, their hasty exit speaking volumes about their feelings regarding the previous evening's events. The grain shipments that the marriage was meant to secure were now uncertain, and several other jarls who had witnessed Bjorn's declaration were already reconsidering their own agreements with him. The practical implications of his choice began weighing on Astrid like stones in her chest as she fully grasped what her exhausted collapse had cost them both. She tried to pull away from him, to retreat into her former role as invisible servant, but his arms tightened around her with unmistakable possessiveness. He told her firmly that there could be no going backward now, that his public claim had been witnessed by too many powerful men to be simply forgotten or ignored. The die had been cast, and they would face whatever consequences emerged together, regardless of the political chaos it might unleash. The morning brought a steady stream of visitors to the hall, each with their own agenda regarding the previous night's unprecedented events. Some came seeking to renegotiate existing agreements, sensing opportunity in what they perceived as Bjorn's weakened position. while others arrived to gauge whether his judgment could still be trusted in matters of war and alliance. Astrid found herself the subject of intense scrutiny from men who had previously looked through her as if she were invisible, their calculating gazes making her skin crawl with discomfort. Bjorn's senior warriors gathered around the high table like protective wolves, their loyalty to their lord evident in the way they positioned themselves to shield both him and Astrid from the most aggressive questioning. These were men who had followed him through countless battles and raids, who trusted his leadership even when they did not fully understand his choices. But even their steadfast support could not entirely mask their concerns about the political ramifications of his actions. The delicate network of alliances that kept their territory secure was beginning to show strain, and everyone knew that winter's approach made stability more crucial than ever. Throughout the morning, Astrid struggled with guilt over her role in creating this crisis, knowing that her moment of weakness had provided the catalyst for Bjorn's dramatic declaration. She had not asked to be claimed publicly, had not sought to disrupt his political marriage. Yet the consequences of her exhausted collapse were now threatening everything he had worked to build. When she tried to express her remorse, he silenced her with a fierce look and the declaration that he regretted nothing about protecting what belonged to him. Though the tension in his voice suggested the situation weighed heavily on him as well. The arrival of Sigrid's uncle, a powerful jarl known for his quick temper and quicker blade, brought the crisis to a head around midday. The man strode into the hall with armed retainers at his back, his face dark with fury over what he saw as a deliberate insult to his family's honor. He demanded compensation for the humiliation inflicted on his niece and suggested that Bjorn's fitness to hold his position should be questioned by the regional thing. The challenge was clear, and the hall fell silent as warriors on both sides shifted their hands to weapons. Bjorn rose slowly from his chair, his own hand resting on his sword hilt as he met the challenger's gaze with steady calm. His response was measured but firm, acknowledging the validity of the grievance while making it clear that he would not be intimidated or forced to abandon his choices. He offered compensation for any perceived insult, but maintained that his household arrangements were his own business, a position that satisfied neither his challenger nor the growing crowd of onlookers who had come to witness this confrontation. The tension in the hall was thick enough to cut with a blade as the two powerful men faced each other across the space where celebrants had danced just hours before. Astrid could feel the weight of history pressing down on them all, knowing that the next few moments would determine not just her own fate, but the political stability of the entire region. Her presence had become the fulcrum on which larger forces balanced, and the responsibility was almost crushing in its magnitude. As arguments flew back and forth between the two factions, Astrid began to understand the true complexity of the situation Bjorn had created with his declaration. It was not simply about her, or even about his marriage to Sigrid, but about the fundamental question of whether personal desires could override political necessities in their harsh world. The visiting jarls were watching carefully to see how this crisis resolved, knowing that the precedent set here would affect their own relationships with subordinates and the stability of arranged marriages throughout the region. The confrontation reached its climax when Sigrid's uncle formally demanded single combat to settle the matter of honor, his challenge ringing through the hall like the sound of a war horn. Bjorn accepted without hesitation, his warrior's pride leaving him no choice, even as Astrid felt her heart sink with the knowledge that blood would now be spilled over her. The formal protocols of Holmgang were invoked, with conditions set and witnesses designated, transforming a political dispute into a matter of personal honor that could only be settled with steel and courage. As preparations for the duel began, Astrid found herself trapped between gratitude for Bjorn's protection and horror at the violence her presence had unleashed. She was no longer simply a thrall serving in the background, but a catalyst for conflicts that could reshape the political landscape of their world. And the weight of that responsibility threatened to crush what remained of her composure. The man who had claimed her publicly was now preparing to risk his life to defend that claim. And she could only watch and pray to whatever gods might listen that love would prove stronger than the forces arrayed against them. The Holmgang circle was marked at dawn on the flat ground behind the Great Hall, its boundaries defined by hazel stakes driven deep into the frost-hard earth and connected by leather cords that would contain the violence to come. Astrid stood at the edge of the growing crowd, Bjorn's cloak still wrapped around her shoulders like armor, while the two men who would determine her fate made their preparations with the methodical calm of seasoned warriors. The morning air was sharp with the promise of winter, and steam rose from the breath of the assembled witnesses as they formed ranks around the fighting ground. Bjorn stripped to the waist despite the cold, his scarred torso bearing testament to decades of violence survived and victories earned, while his challenger, Gunnar, did likewise with the confidence of a man 20 years younger. Both warriors carried swords of finest steel, weapons that had been passed down through generations and blessed by skalds who knew the proper words to wake the killing spirits that slept within the metal. The formal words of challenge and acceptance were spoken before the assembled crowd, binding both men to fight until one yielded, fled the circle, or died within its confines. As the combatants took their positions, Astrid caught fragments of conversation from the watching nobles, their words revealing the larger implications of this seemingly personal conflict. Several mentioned that the outcome would be seen as a judgment from the gods themselves about the legitimacy of Bjorn's claim on her, while others spoke more pragmatically about how a change in leadership might affect their trade agreements and military alliances. She realized with growing horror that her fate had become intertwined with political machinations far beyond anything she had imagined when she first shared Bjorn's bed. The younger Sigrid appeared at the edge of the crowd, her face pale but determined as she watched the man who had humiliated her prepared to fight for the right to keep his thrall mistress. Their eyes met briefly across the circle, and Astrid saw not hatred but a kind of resigned understanding in the girl's expression, as if she too had come to recognize the futility of fighting against the force that had drawn Bjorn to make his dramatic declaration. The political marriage that was supposed to secure her future had become a casualty of something larger and more dangerous than either of them could control. The fight began with a thunderous clash of steel that echoed off the timber walls of the surrounding buildings, both warriors testing each other's defenses with careful probing attacks that revealed more about skill than commitment. Gunnar was faster and stronger, his youth evident in the fluidity of his movements. But Bjorn fought with the canny intelligence of a man who had survived countless battles by thinking as well as striking. Their weapons rang together in a deadly rhythm that mesmerized the watching crowd, each exchange bringing them closer to the violence that would decide everything. Blood flowed within minutes as both men opened wounds that stained their bare skin in the cold morning light, and Astrid found herself gripping the foxfur trim of Bjorn's cloak so tightly that her knuckles went white. Every cut her protector sustained felt like a personal wound, and she began to understand that her feelings for him ran deeper than mere gratitude or physical attraction. The man fighting in that circle was risking not just his life, but his position, his lands, and his legacy for the right to keep her by his side, and the magnitude of that sacrifice was almost overwhelming. As the combat intensified, Astrid became aware of whispered conversations around her that revealed disturbing truths about her own past. And of the older warriors mentioned that her mother had been more than just a captured Irish slave, that she had been a woman of noble birth whose family had paid significant ransom for her return, money that had been accepted but the woman never released. The implication that Astrid herself might have claimed a status beyond slavery hung in the air like smoke, adding another layer of complexity to an already impossible situation. The revelation about her heritage struck Astrid like a physical blow, recontextualizing everything she had believed about her place in the world and her relationship with Bjorn. If she was not merely a thrall, but the daughter of nobility, however distantly removed, then his public claim on her took on different implications entirely. The watching nobles would see it not as a man's weakness for his property, but as a political alliance with potential foreign connections, transforming her from liability into potential asset in ways that made her head spin with possibility and terror. Bjorn stumbled as Gunnar's blade found his ribs, opening a wound that sent crimson streaming down his side. And the crowd's reaction told Astrid everything she needed to know about how the fight was progressing. Several of his own men shifted restlessly, hands moving to weapon hilts as they calculated whether honor would demand they avenge their lord's death if the worst happened. The political ramifications of Bjorn's potential defeat began crystallizing around them like ice forming on still water, each possibility more dire than the last. The younger warrior pressed his advantage with the ruthless efficiency of a born killer, driving Bjorn back toward the edge of the circle where defeat would mean dishonor even without death. But something in the way Gunnar moved triggered recognition in Astrid's memory, a familiar fluidity that reminded her of nights when shadows had moved outside her sleeping quarters in ways that had made her skin crawl with unease. The possibility that this challenge was not spontaneous outrage, but calculated strategy designed to remove Bjorn from power hit her like cold water to the face. As understanding dawned, Astrid realized that her collapse and Bjorn's subsequent declaration had provided the perfect pretext for a coup that had likely been planned for months. Gunnar's righteous anger over his niece's humiliation was convenient cover for ambitions that had nothing to do with family honor and everything to do with seizing control of Bjorn's prosperous lands and strategic position. The man fighting for her was not just defending their relationship, but battling for his very survival against enemies who had used her as unwitting bait in their trap. The knowledge that she had been manipulated, that her exhaustion and collapse had been anticipated and exploited by Bjorn's enemies, filled Astrid with a rage that burned hotter than forge fire. She began moving through the crowd with purpose, her mind racing as she considered what information she might possess that could turn the tide of this carefully orchestrated crisis. If Gunnar's challenge was based on deception rather than honor, then perhaps the rules that governed it could be challenged as well. Though doing so would require courage she was not sure she possessed. Astrid's voice cut through the morning air like a blade as she stepped forward into the circle, her copper hair catching the pale sunlight as she made the accusation that would either save them all or damn her to immediate death. She declared before the assembled witnesses that Gunnar's challenge was built on false pretenses, that he had orchestrated events to create grounds for removing Bjorn from power, and that she had evidence of his deception hidden where only she could retrieve it. The fighting stopped instantly as both warriors and spectators turned toward her in shock, the formal protocols of Holmgang disrupted by an intervention that had no precedent in their laws or customs. The crowd erupted in confusion and angry shouts as Astrid's challenge to the proceedings threatened to invalidate everything that had already transpired. Gunnar's face contorted with rage as he realized his carefully laid plans were unraveling. But he could not simply kill her without confirming the truth of her accusations in the minds of the witnesses. Bjorn stood frozen in the center of the circle, blood streaming from multiple wounds, torn between pride at her courage and terror at the risk she had just accepted. Under their laws, false accusation of this magnitude was punishable by death, and she had just wagered her life on evidence that might not even exist. The senior jarls present demanded immediate proof of her claims. their voices raised in anger at having their time wasted by what they assumed was a desperate gambit by a thrall seeking to save her protector's life. But Astrid held her ground with the poise of someone who had finally found her purpose, explaining that she had overheard Gunnar's men discussing their plans during the wedding feast and had seen correspondence that revealed the premeditated nature of their challenge. Her words carried enough conviction to give the nobles pause, though several demanded she produce this evidence immediately or face the consequences of perjury. Bjorn's eyes met hers across the circle, and she saw in his gaze both admiration and heartbreak, as if he understood that her intervention might save him, but would almost certainly cost her everything. The love that had driven him to make his public declaration was now reflected back at him magnified, as she risked certain death to protect what they had built together. The political crisis that had seemed unsolvable moments before was transforming into something even more dangerous. A test of truth that would be decided by forces beyond either of their control. Gunnar attempted to dismiss her accusations as the desperate lies of a woman trying to save her lover's skin. But his protests carried an undertone of panic that several sharp-eyed observers noticed immediately. His hasty departure from the circle to consult with his retainers suggested guilt rather than righteous indignation, and whispered speculation began spreading through the crowd about what evidence Astrid might actually possess. The Holmgang that should have been a simple matter of honor had become a complex investigation that threatened to expose corruption reaching far beyond this single conflict. The evidence Astrid claimed to possess was hidden in the one place no one would think to look. Sewn into the lining of the sleeping furs in her quarters, where she had concealed documents she had found while serving in Gunnar's hall during his previous visits. Her ability to read, a skill she had learned from an Irish monk among the other slaves, had allowed her to understand correspondence that revealed the conspiracy against Bjorn long before his wedding provided the perfect opportunity to execute it. The letters detailed not just plans to remove him, but schemes to divide his lands among several collaborators who had been pretending loyalty while planning betrayal. As Astrid led a procession of nobles and warriors to retrieve the evidence, she felt the weight of destiny pressing down on her shoulders with crushing force. Everything she had ever been or hoped to become was balanced on this moment. And failure would mean not just her own death, but Bjorn's downfall and the success of a conspiracy that would reshape the political landscape of their entire region. Her hands trembled as she located the hidden documents, each one representing a choice between safety and truth that she had made in the darkness of her servitude. The correspondence, when brought into the morning light and read before the assembled witnesses, proved even more damning than Astrid had hoped. The letters revealed not just plans to remove Bjorn, but detailed schemes to manipulate the marriage negotiations, to position Gunnar's challenge regardless of the wedding's outcome, and to divide the conquered territories among a network of conspirators that included several jarls present at the gathering. The scope of the betrayal was breathtaking in its ambition and terrifying in its implications for the stability of their world. Gunnar's reaction to the exposure of his correspondence was swift and violent, his warrior's instincts driving him to attack before the implications could fully sink in among the witnesses. His blade sought Astrid's throat with the desperate fury of a man whose life's work had just crumbled to ash. But Bjorn intercepted the strike with movements that defied his wounds, their steel meeting in a clash that rang like thunder across the morning air. The Holmgang had become something far more desperate, a battle not just for honor but for the truth that would determine the fate of kingdoms. The fight that resumed was no longer governed by formal rules but by the raw necessity of survival, as both men understood that only one of them would live to see sunset. Astrid watched in horror as the blood loss from Bjorn's earlier wounds began taking its toll, his movements growing slower and less precise while his younger opponent pressed every advantage with ruthless determination. The political conspiracy had become personal vendetta, and she realized with growing dread that her intervention might have doomed them both rather than saving either. The crowd had divided into factions based on the revelations contained in the letters, with some nobles moving to secure the other conspirators, while others positioned themselves to exploit whatever chaos emerged from the combat's conclusion. Astrid found herself at the center of a maelstrom that threatened to tear their entire society apart. Her search for truth having unleashed forces that none of them might be able to control. The simple question of her relationship with Bjorn had become the catalyst for a reckoning that would determine the future of their world. As the combat reached its climax, Astrid realized that regardless of its outcome, nothing would ever be the same again. The exposure of the conspiracy had shattered the trust that held their alliances together, and even Bjorn's victory would leave him ruling over a fractured realm where every neighbor might be a potential enemy. Her courage in speaking out had saved his life, but potentially destroyed everything he had worked to build. And the weight of that responsibility threatened to crush what remained of her composure as steel, sang its deadly song in the morning air. The moment Bjorn's sword found Gunnar's heart marked not victory, but the beginning of a more complex and dangerous phase of their struggle for survival. The younger man's death sent shockwaves through the assembled nobles that went far beyond simple justice, as the implications of the exposed conspiracy began reshaping alliances in real time around the blood-stained circle. Astrid watched 3 jarls immediately declare their continued loyalty to Bjorn, while 2 others quietly began withdrawing their retinues, their involvement in the plot evident to anyone who understood the subtle politics of survival that governed their world. The evidence she had provided proved more valuable than gold, but it also painted targets on both their backs that would persist long after this immediate crisis passed. Several of the conspirators named in the letters had not been present for the Holmgang, and their absence now took on sinister implications as Bjorn and his remaining allies calculated. How many enemies remained in the shadows? The victory that should have secured their position had instead revealed the depth of the forces arrayed against them, transforming them from established rulers into hunted rebels in their own territory. Bjorn's wounds required immediate attention, but he insisted on maintaining appearances until all the witnesses had dispersed, knowing that any sign of weakness might encourage another challenge before he had time to heal. Astrid found herself thrust into a position of unexpected authority, as nobles who had ignored her existence hours earlier now sought her counsel about the political ramifications of the morning's revelations. Her literacy, previously unknown to most of them, had become a strategic asset that made her more valuable than any dowry or alliance marriage could provide. The practical consequences of their situation began crystallizing as the day progressed and messengers arrived with news from the surrounding territories. 2 of the jarls named in the conspiracy had already fled their lands, taking portable wealth and abandoning their holdings rather than face the reckoning that was surely coming. But others had chosen to fight, and reports spoke of armed bands moving through the countryside toward Bjorn's territory, forcing him to consider whether he could defend his position while still weakened from battle. Sigurd's return to the hall around midday brought an unexpected complication to their already dire circumstances, as the young woman announced her intention to remain married to Bjorn despite the humiliation of the previous evening. Her reasoning was coldly practical rather than romantic, as she explained that her family's grain supplies were now essential for surviving the coming siege, and that political alliance remained their best hope for mutual survival. The marriage that had seemed destroyed by his declaration of love for Astrid was being rebuilt on foundations of mutual necessity. The 3-way conversation that followed tested everyone's capacity for diplomacy as they attempted to navigate a situation with no precedent in their experience or laws. Bjorn's public claim on Astrid could not be rescinded without destroying his credibility. But maintaining it while honoring his marriage to Sigrid required careful negotiation that satisfied honor on all sides. The solution they eventually reached was unprecedented but practical, establishing Astrid as his acknowledged woman while recognizing Sigrid as his wife, a distinction that would require constant vigilance to maintain. As evening approached and defensive preparations began in earnest, Astrid found herself coordinating with Sigrid in ways that should have been impossible given the circumstances of their relationship. The younger woman's political acumen was sharper than her youth suggested, and she understood better than anyone the precarious nature of their position. Their cooperation was born of necessity rather than friendship, but it provided a foundation for the kind of complex household arrangements that might allow all three of them to survive what was coming. The approaching threat from the surviving conspirators forced Bjorn to make desperate choices about alliance and defense that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. He sent messages to jarls he had fought against in the past, offering partnership in exchange for military support, while simultaneously preparing his stronghold for siege. The political landscape was shifting so rapidly that yesterday's enemies might become today's allies, and the only constant was the need to survive until spring brought new possibilities. Astrid's role in their defense preparations went far beyond her previous duties as a servant, as her ability to read and write made her essential for managing the correspondence that would determine their fate. She found herself crafting messages that balanced truth and diplomacy in equal measure, seeking to build new alliances without revealing the full extent of their vulnerability. The skills she had developed in secrecy were now being used openly, transforming her from hidden asset into acknowledged partner in ways that felt both liberating and terrifying. The arrival of Bjorn's brother Magnus at sunset brought both hope and complication to their desperate situation, as the relationship between the two men had been strained for years over questions of inheritance and authority. But the threat facing them was large enough to overcome past grievances, and Magnus brought with him 50 seasoned warriors who could make the difference between successful defense and catastrophic defeat. His acceptance of Astrid's position in the household, while grudging, provided crucial legitimacy for the unprecedented arrangements they were attempting to establish. As night fell and the first watch was set, the three people whose fates had become so inexorably intertwined sat together in the hall that had witnessed so much transformation over the past 2 days. Bjorn's wounds were healing cleanly, but the political damage from the conspiracy's exposure would take much longer to repair, if it ever could be. Astrid and Sigrid maintained careful courtesy with each other, both understanding that their survival depended on making their unusual arrangement work despite the personal costs involved. The final preparations for what they all knew would be a winter of warfare were completed as snow began falling outside the horn windows, each flake marking time's passage toward an uncertain spring. Their enemies would come with the weather, seeking to use the season's harshness as a weapon against defenders already weakened by political upheaval. But they would meet that threat together, the jarl and his wife and his chosen woman, bound by circumstance into an alliance that might prove stronger than any of the traditional bonds that governed their world. The first attack came 3 days before the winter solstice, when the snow lay deep enough to muffle footsteps and the shortened days provided cover for approaching armies. Astrid woke to the sound of war horns echoing across the frozen landscape, their brazen voices calling Bjorn's warriors to positions they had prepared during weeks of desperate anticipation. From the hall's upper windows, she could see torches moving like fallen stars across the white expanse where their enemies approached, and the sight sent ice through her veins that had nothing to do with the winter air. The siege lines that formed around Bjorn's stronghold represented more than just military strategy, as each banner planted in the frozen ground carried the weight of political grievance and personal ambition that had driven their bearers to risk everything in winter warfare. The surviving conspirators had gathered forces from across 3 kingdoms, promising land and plunder to warriors willing to brave the season's fury for the chance to reshape the balance of power. Their army was larger than anyone had anticipated, suggesting support from enemies they had not yet identified. Bjorn moved through the defensive preparations with the calm efficiency of a man who had spent his life preparing for moments like this, but Astrid could see the weight of responsibility in the set of his shoulders as he calculated odds that grew worse with each passing hour. His wounds from the home gang had healed cleanly, but the political damage from the conspiracy's exposure had left him with fewer allies than any previous crises had required. The loyalty of his own warriors was absolute, but loyalty alone might not be enough to overcome the numerical disadvantage they faced. The first assault was a probing attack designed to test their defenses rather than breach them. But even this limited engagement revealed the sophisticated planning behind their enemy's campaign. The attackers moved with coordination that spoke of unified command and careful preparation. Their tactics adapted to winter conditions in ways that suggested this siege had been planned long before the conspiracy's exposure provided justification. Astrid realized with growing horror that they had been walking into a trap that was far larger and more complex than anyone had suspected. As the day progressed and attacks intensified, the 3 people whose relationship had triggered this crisis found themselves working together with an efficiency born of shared desperation. Sigrid proved unexpectedly capable at coordinating supply lines and managing the wounded, while Astrid's literacy made her essential for maintaining communication with potential allies. Bjorn commanded the military response with skill that reminded everyone why he had held power for so long. But even his tactical genius could not overcome the simple mathematics of their situation. The turning point came when Magnus led a sortie against the siege engines that threatened to breach their walls. His warriors charging through knee-deep snow with the fury of men fighting for their homeland. The attack succeeded in destroying 2 catapults and killing dozens of their enemies. But the cost was higher than they could afford, with Magnus himself falling to enemy arrows as he covered his men's retreat. His death struck Bjorn like a physical blow, removing both military support and the last hope of reconciliation with his estranged brother. Night brought a temporary respite from direct assault, but the psychological pressure of encirclement began taking its toll on defenders and civilians alike. Astrid found herself moving through the stronghold like a spirit of encouragement, her presence somehow providing comfort to warriors who saw in her the cause worth fighting for that elevated their struggle above mere survival. The woman who had once been invisible property had become a symbol of something larger than herself, though she remained uncertain whether that symbol was inspiration or curse. The enemy's strategy became clear as the siege progressed into its second day. With their commanders demonstrating patience that suggested they understood winter would be their greatest ally, rather than waste men in costly assaults, they were content to tighten their encirclement and wait for hunger and cold to weaken the defenders' resolve. The political message was equally clear: surrender Astrid and accept new leadership, or watch everyone die for the sake of one woman's freedom. Bjorn's response to the ultimatum was delivered by arrow shot into the enemy camp at dawn. Its message brief and uncompromising: he would die before abandoning what belonged to him, and any who wished to test that resolve were welcome to try. The declaration sent ripples of admiration through his own forces and visible frustration through the besiegers' ranks, as it became clear that this would not be resolved through negotiation or intimidation. Blood would decide the outcome, as it always had in their harsh world. The most devastating blow came when fires broke out in the storehouses where their winter food supplies were kept. Flames that spread too quickly and burned too hot to be accidents of war. The sabotage spoke of enemies within their own walls, Supporters of the conspiracy who had remained hidden until this moment of maximum leverage, as Astrid watched months of careful preparation turn to smoke and ash, she felt the weight of responsibility crushing down on her with the force of an avalanche. The discovery that their provisions had been systematically poisoned as well as burned transformed strategic disadvantage into immediate catastrophe. As warriors began succumbing to sickness that left them unable to fight effectively, someone among their own people had been planning this moment for months, preparing multiple methods of weakening their defense until resistance became impossible. The betrayal was more complete than anyone had imagined, and it left them facing not just external enemies, but internal corruption that could not be easily identified or eliminated. As the second night fell and their situation grew increasingly desperate, the three people whose love had started this crisis met in private to discuss options that ranged from hopeless to impossible. Surrender would mean death for Bjorn and enslavement for both women, but continued resistance seemed likely to result in the destruction of everyone who had remained loyal. The choice between personal honor and collective survival was the kind that defined heroes in the songs of skalds. But living through it proved far more complex and painful than any story suggested, as the weight of others' lives pressed down on them with crushing force. The final assault began at dawn on the winter solstice, when the weakened defenders had been worn down by hunger, cold, and the constant pressure of encirclement into shadows of their former strength. Astrid stood beside Bjorn on the palisade wall, watching the enemy forces mass for what everyone knew would be the decisive engagement. Their banners bright against the snow like wounds against clean linen. The sight should have filled her with despair, but instead, she felt a strange peace settling over her as she finally understood what choice lay before them all. The enemy army stretched across the frozen landscape like a dark sea, their numbers swollen by warriors who had been promised easy victory and rich plunder once the defiant jarl was brought low. But something in their formation struck Astrid as wrong, a subtle displacement that spoke of division rather than unity among their ranks. Her sharp eyes, trained by years of watching for the subtle signs that meant survival for someone of her station, caught the hesitation in certain sections that suggested not all their enemies were equally committed to this cause. Bjorn's voice carried across the stronghold as he addressed his remaining warriors, his words cutting through the morning air with the authority of a man who had never asked others to follow where he would not lead. He spoke of honor and loyalty, of the bonds that held their society together, and the price that must be paid to preserve what they valued most. His speech was not the desperate rallying cry of a doomed leader, but the calm acknowledgement of a man who understood exactly what he was choosing and why the choice was worth making. The first wave of attackers broke against their walls like water against stone, the defenders' desperation lending strength to arms weakened by privation and exhaustion. Astrid found herself wielding a knife with deadly efficiency, her movements guided by the survival instincts that had kept her alive through years of bondage and uncertainty. She was no longer fighting just for her own life, but for the right to determine her own fate. And that knowledge transformed her from victim into warrior in ways that surprised even herself. As the battle raged around the outer defenses, Sigrid proved that political marriages could produce unexpected strength under pressure, her coordination of the stronghold's interior defenses freeing Bjorn to focus on the military aspects of their survival. The two women worked together with an efficiency that transcended their unusual circumstances. Their cooperation, born of mutual respect earned through shared hardship rather than the artificial bonds of social expectation. The tide of battle began turning when Magnus's surviving men, thought lost in the previous day's fighting, appeared behind the enemy lines with the fury of the vengeful dead. Their surprise attack caught the besiegers at the moment of their greatest confidence, turning organized assault into confused melee as warriors found themselves fighting on two fronts simultaneously. The reversal was not complete victory, but it provided the defenders with hope that had been absent for days. The personal confrontation that had been building throughout the siege finally materialized when the conspiracy's surviving leader, a jarl named Thorvald, whom Bjorn had once considered a friend, breached the inner courtyard with a select group of warriors. The betrayal was complete now, revealed in its full scope as men who had shared meat and mead around the same table now faced each other across drawn steel. Their combat was brief and brutal, settled by the simple fact that Bjorn fought for love while his enemy fought only for ambition. As afternoon sunlight slanted through the smoke of burning buildings, the siege finally broke when several enemy contingents withdrew from the field rather than continue, fighting for leaders whose true motives had become increasingly clear. The conspiracy's political foundation crumbled as warriors who had expected easy victory instead found themselves trapped in winter warfare against enemies who refused to surrender. Without unified purpose, the attacking force began fragmenting into smaller groups focused on survival rather than conquest. The aftermath of victory brought little celebration, as the cost of their survival was written in the bodies scattered throughout the stronghold, and the smoke rising from buildings that would need complete rebuilding before spring. Nearly half of Bjorn's loyal warriors had fallen during the siege, and the political landscape around them had been so thoroughly disrupted that years would be required to establish new stability. They had won the right to survive, but the world they had fought to preserve was gone forever. Astrid found herself standing in the great hall where this entire crisis had begun, surrounded by the wreckage of what had once been a carefully ordered life. The woman who had collapsed from exhaustion during a wedding feast now bore scars from actual combat, and her relationship with Bjorn had been tempered by shared violence into something harder and more precious than mere romance. They had chosen each other repeatedly under the worst possible circumstances, and those choices had cost them everything except each other. The resolution of their unusual household arrangement came not through grand declarations, but through the quiet recognition that they had already proven what mattered most during the siege. Sigrid's courage and competence had earned her a position of genuine respect rather than mere political convenience, while Astrid's literacy and tactical insights had made her indispensable in ways that transcended her original status as property. The three of them had forged something unprecedented from the ruins of traditional expectations, and it would serve as foundation for whatever they chose to build next. Spring brought messengers carrying news that the conspiracy's collapse had created opportunities for new alliances across the region, but also warnings that the disruption they had helped cause was attracting attention from larger powers. Their survival had been purchased with isolation that might prove more dangerous than the original threat. As neighboring kingdoms began calculating whether a weakened Bjorn represented opportunity or liability in their own strategic planning. The final image that would remain in the songs of future skalds was not one of glorious victory, but of three people working together to rebuild what they had fought so hard to preserve. Bjorn's hair had gone gray during the siege. Sigrid had learned to smile again despite everything she had lost, and Astrid had discovered that freedom was not a gift to be given, but a choice to be made repeatedly, regardless of the cost. They had paid the price their harsh world demanded for the right to love as they chose, and they would continue paying it for as long as they drew breath.